All right, I am now joined by Jason Lee Bias, who is a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Michigan, about an hour away from where I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan. And he is a writer for the Center for State and Society. So thank you so much for joining me today, Jason.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I thought that one way that would be fun to kind of kick this off um, is by thinking about a objection to libertarianism that a lot of libertarians seem to take extremely unseriously, because there are like 1,000 memes about this. Now that I've always thought was a pretty good objection, which is if you're at least an extreme libertarian, you're not a minarchist, who thinks we can have who doesn't like, who doesn't like welfareism, but thinks we could have a minimal state, but you're kind of libertarian, a center for a stateless society, we shouldn't have a state at all. Then who will build the roads? And that, as I said, always struck me as a pretty good objection. But I think, I very often see, libertarians kind of like blowing this off or, making it a punchline. What about the roads? But I did see an article, and I should say before we start talking about this, that it is an old article. Your thinking on this may have, evolved in various ways since then. But I did see an article about this by you, where you took a line that I haven't seen anybody else take before about this, which is to say, instead of either just blowing off the question, or having some sort of answer along the lines of no, don't worry, we really, the free market really will lead to an interstate highway system in its own way. Your answer seemed then to be, nobody, at least for the kind of roads you're thinking of, nobody, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. So I do want to note, to be clear, I am not an economist or anything like that. So I'm not a specialist on kinds of questions about practical functionality on a lot of these things. But I do think so that roads, just road simpliciter, that you don't need the state for that, right? Historically, there's been several privately built roads, and not just privately owned and operated like toll roads, but roads that are free roads, right? Community kind of operated more than by like a private company. Those have existed historically, but what seems notable, at least, is the interstate highway system as we know it. I don't know of it's possible that you could have something similar to an interstate highway system, but I'm not going to get into the details on that, because the thing that's more important to me is that we don't quite know what is the best means of transportation. And part of the answer here might be something more along the lines of where we're going. We don't need roads, because namely, alongside the creation of the interstate highway system, there's at least a couple problems that you might say that would be benefits of not having interstate highway system. One, obvious environmental issues, right? The car culture, and the way that might contribute to climate change or any other environmental issues. And then secondly, it can also be kind of a subtle subsidy for kind of like big box stores, right? Things that rely on using the free for them interstate highway system and doing wear and tear to them in a way that is totally free, but obviously they're getting significantly more benefit from than smaller kinds of businesses. So those are two kinds of reasons why it might be good to have something other than interstate highway system. But then the question is, of course, okay, well, what is that thing? And here I'm going to be a lot less persuasive, but essentially the thought is we don't really know what the other thing might be, because that's been artificially crowded out by the kind of assumption of an interstate highway system being the way to go, and massive state, both state financing and state violence, in the sense of seizing people's property for the creation of the interstate highway system. And so we don't know what alternatives there might be.
Yeah, so I mean, I would be very worried about that, that lack of knowledge because if maybe there's an alternative, then maybe it would be an acceptable one. But that's a big that's a big maybe. And
Right.
I certainly hear the importance of the environmental concern about some of the some of the practices of these companies, and there might be a case for more localism about distribution networks. But if that is the best solution, I would rather have that be something that's collectively and democratically decided, that we want to have more localism about distribution, and we can take regulatory steps to do that, because I get really obviously it's true that big corporations have massive political influence and are able to get all sorts of in many ways, right? They get more out of state infrastructure than they put into it, right? No doubt about that. But at the same time, like, one really good thing about having an interstate highway system, for example, is that we don't, that I can, that I can drive from, from Atlanta, where I teach, to Michigan, where my parents live, without, with that I can do that, like, relatively inexpensively, as an individual person, and because I'm not that worried about, I mean, like a big, like a sufficiently profitable corporation, like, yeah, where they're going, they don't need roads. I mean, like, it might be very nice and convenient for them to have roads, right? But they could probably, in a world without roads, they could probably fly a lot of their merchandise, and so we're, that we're worried about mobility for regular people, that would, so, like, if, in other words, if it's bad for the environment or just unfair in terms of their ability to profit, off of the public purse, for them to be able to move their stuff around like this, then okay, we can do things to stop them from doing that. But I don't want the collateral damage of that to be that ordinary, working class people can't, move around freely, in ways that having something like an interstate highway system really permits. And to maybe, pivot a little bit before I throw back to you, from, like, the extremely specific details of this example to some much more general concerns about what a governmentless market, society might look like. One of the really bad things, like, you can have public roads that are toll roads, but at least we all get some sort of collective input about what the tolls are going to be set at. The people who set the tolls are at least appointed by people that we elect, which might not be an ideal level of democratic input, but it's something. Whereas if you have private roads, then the toll is whatever the road owner says it is, and it might or might not, be profitable for any particular road owner to set that at a reasonable place. It's almost certainly not going to be set at nothing. And you could also, I mean, look, if I'm a private road owner, without violating any libertarian principles about aggression or anything, like, I could just decide that I don't want people, like, that there are certain categories of people I just don't want traveling on my roads, and this is, and it's certainly not going to be the case that, oh, I'll just take my business, to another road. Maybe I can, to a certain extent, but roads don't seem like the sort of good that you're going to have this vast crowded marketplace of different people operating different roads from the same starting point to the same ending point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot there, obviously. I'm certainly skeptical of the thought that that ordinary people benefit more from the interstate highway system than places like Walmart. Certainly Walmart is moving significantly larger amount of goods. I guess
Walmart certainly makes more money off them.
Right. Yeah. They technically could fly, but that seems pretty onerous. Things like that. And I certainly don't want to say that I'm against roads. Like, and so there's some people. So for example, I might be wrong about this, but I think social anarchist Paul Goodman was supported banning roads or something like that, which is no banning cars, but still banning. Yeah, right. So I'm critical of like car culture, at least in an institutional way, but I'm not going to be like that. I do think that there are benefits to having roads, right? One thing that I do want to note is I might have misunderstood you, but it seemed like you were assuming that any road that would exist in a stateless libertarian society would be privately owned by a specific party, right? I don't think that's correct. So a lot of like anarcho-capitalists are going to talk like that, obviously, some of them very explicitly, but I don't think, I think we have to separate state property and common property or public property in just generic sense, right? So historically speaking, a lot of the privately created roads are not privately owned roads, right? They're going to be kind of privately created by someone who perhaps initially has some financial interest in there being a road there, but then it's kind of donated to the community in a certain sense. And now, why would that be the case? There's all sorts of reasons there, but historically, that is something that has happened. And similarly, you could have people building roads themselves, right? And there's no reason to assume that it would have to be privately owned by every single one would have to be privately owned, right? And historically, many of these have had been free roads without tolls, right? But the more important thing to me is the assumption here that there's some sense in which we're really all owning the interstate highway system, or we really all have collective input into it. Because I would want to question that. It doesn't seem to me that I have much control over the interstate highway system, right? There are certainly private parties in the sense of individual people who have a lot more control over that than I do. And I think the original article that you're pointing to, it's been like 7 years. I read it really quickly before we did this, but one of the points I'm putting out there is there was a controversy a few years ago in New Jersey where there was kind of a artificially created traffic jam because of some political interests by the people who were in control of like the New Jersey Port Authority, and there was some suspicion that maybe Chris Christie was involved, so on and so forth. But the thing that was notable to me was that someone was able to just pettily just decide that we're going to have a traffic jam here. And that's something that happens when you have centralized control of some important good like roads. And of course, you're going to say, well, that would also be the case with a private road. And of course it is. But
it's not just that it could also be the case with the private road, but that the difference between those two situations, right? A libertarian utopia where, and we can talk about how likely it is that, that roads would be donated to the community or would just be held as kind of commons. But if we are talking about the scenario where there is a road owner, then what Chris Christie is accused of doing in New Jersey with Bridgegate, the difference is that in such a society, that would be completely legal. That it wouldn't be a one-time thing that was a giant scandal that ended his career. It would be something that could happen right out in the open with no hiding it and no pretense, and just look, this is my road. I can do with it what I like, which I think to me gets back to that point about, okay, do you control the roads? Do I control the roads? Well, it's certainly true. Not going to get any argument from me on this point that there are some people who have much more control over state goods than other people. That's true both in the Chris Christie sense that you are going to have elected officials who have more control over it than the rest of us. Although again, we what Christie did there is illegal and was a major scandal, when it came out.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's certainly true that anything that's state owned, will be, if it's a democratic state, there'll be elected officials who are controlling it. If it's an undemocratic state, there'll be unelected officials.
Mhm.
And it's also true, though, and I take this to be part of your point, that there are just people who, due to their position in society, have more influence over the state than other people. And you're obviously, obviously this is a point of commonality, right? I mean, I certainly agree
Mhm.
that we have a ruling class. But what I would say is, do we have, do we control the roads, right? You and I
Right.
control the roads. And I think that's not a simple yes or no question. I think it's not, yes we do or no we don't, but we do to some extent. And what I think is that we don't to nearly enough of an
Mhm.
extent, because we have a ruling class, because
Mhm.
our system, is very severely incompletely democratic. But having some control over it is still better than having no control over them, and just having a system where the road owner could do a bridge gate out in the open without hiding it and covering it up like Chris Christie did. This, or we could have, similar discussion about like the police, that like that is
Agree very
as
much.
bad and racist and oppressive as the police are. The one thing that sounds scarier than that to me is a privately owned police department that wasn't even theoretically accountable to the people that it's brutalizing.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. So the thing that I would want to emphasize there is, while it is of course true that you could have a out in the open similar thing with a I would say we're talking about an actually literally privately owned road, right?
Yeah,
In that case, it's of course possible, but also people would not be required to finance it, right? And you are required to finance it in the scenario that we actually live in, right? You're
right.
required to continue financing it. There is no alternative to the state's private roads, owns roads that are privately owned by the state. Um, and that's not the sort of, and I don't think the solution to this is hoping for a centralized power structure to end up benefiting someone outside of the ruling class, because of course they do, but when they do, it tends to be because it's necessary to maintain kind of enough support in order to maintain the power of the state and its clients in the first place, right? That it's not that whatever the state is going to do is going to be the things that people who have better access to the state are going to want it to do, right? And so you're going to expect that uh, the benefits and kind of the benefits of state ownership are going to be only those things that are necessary to maintain the power, right? It's not going to be um, it's ultimately going to have to it's ultimately still going to be the interest of the already powerful, because those will be the ones with greater access to to deciding how the state uses its resources, right?
Yeah. So again, I mean, this all seems to be a way of saying that we have a ruling class, and it can be successfully pressured
Mhm.
to give concessions to everybody else. But until you change the fundamental economic structure of society, it is ultimately going to be in charge, which is certainly true. But again, I go back to the difference between having severely limited control over something, because okay, we can vote out the people who are controlling it, but our elections are
Mhm.
undemocratic in various ways, and etc. So having severely limited public control over something, to having no public control and no
Mhm.
pretense of public control. And when I start thinking about the scenario where there's no pretense of public control over things that are currently that are currently publicly owned, that are currently state goods, then I think I'm not very comforted, by the thought that, oh, at least I won't have to finance it. I mean, like if
Mhm.
if I'm worried, if I'm a poor person and I'm worried about whether I'm going to be allowed to travel on a road owned by a rich person, whether they're going to jack up the rate so much that it's going to be inaccessible to me, or whether they're
Mhm.
just going to decide, that I'm on the ban list, that I'm just on the blacklist of people who aren't allowed to be on their road, because, maybe because of my political activities,
Mhm.
then it's not very much comfort to me to say, well, at least I don't have to finance it. In fact, the fact that I'm not financing it, the fact that it is private, rather than a collective effort, would be my whole problem.
Mhm. Right. So again, I don't think I think you're assuming way more uh, collective input than input from the average person than is plausible. However, um, while it is true that the private input, okay, let me back up. So there's two kinds of scenarios that I think one of we're assuming we're kind of coming at this with two different scenarios in mind here. So um, the scenario you seem to have in mind is uh, that that for some of these important resources, that it's ultimately going to be some private monopolist, right, who owns so much of it that there really is no alternative, right?
Well,
So for really,
even if they only own a 2 mile stretch of it, all the
uh,
same problems still apply.
so okay, so what I was going to say was that what looks a lot more realistic to me is that someone might own one 2 mile stretch of something and then that person be particularly bad, right? Whereas there are realistically all sorts of normal routes that you can go through, and it doesn't really serve that so it doesn't really impact that your life that much. That
Although,
seems much more plausible to me.
well,
Uh,
I think it would still, impact your life. I think that, um, I mean, if you do have road owners, even stretch of road owners, which I do find, by the way, I should say, I do find more plausible than thinking that there are roads that are just going to be kept as commons, right? There is, I mean, you're right. There is a distinction between public property in the sense of state property and, the commons, like what existed in, medieval England, that kind of commons, or lots of commons areas that still exist all over the place now. But things that are commons but not, state property, tend to be things that whatever sort of upkeep, they require, are things that, that could just sort of happen in a very informal way. A lot of them don't require any upkeep, like a lake or something like that. I think that for something like and I think that there are roads in previous historical eras that are much more like that, right? That, like, sure, maybe you need to clear some trash over all that, but like a fairly informal arrangement without
right.
really worried about paying anybody to do it could
Mhm.
get it done. And certainly, if you're thinking about things like interstate highways, that's going to be a very different situation.
Right. Yeah.
So if you only had, like, let's say that you're on the blacklist, right? Which and as we use that metaphor, let's remember that the original blacklist was largely a private, free market affair. That there was some political pressure, but this is something that was, like, made and enforced by the Hollywood studios privately, right? So you're on a blacklist, and so there are certain, the owners of a 2 mile stretch here, the owners of a 2 mile stretch there, won't let you travel on theirs. How much does it inconvenience you? Well, I mean, look, how much did Bridgegate
Mhm.
inconvenience anybody?
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, in some ways, not very much, because there was, like, one day that
Mhm.
they weren't able to quickly travel over this
Mhm.
one particular bridge. That there were doubtless alternate routes that some people
Mhm.
ended up taking that day. But in some ways, quite a bit, right? I think there was like I think there was one person who died, because they didn't get to a hospital in a timely way.
Mhm.
And so I think when you think about, a 2 mile stretch, 10 mile stretch of road, being something that somebody for various reasons couldn't travel on, whether it's the blacklist scenario, whether it's that, like, they that, like, today, it's like the gas station, that, like, you don't know what the price is going to be, for traveling on the
Mhm.
road, and until you get there. Could it impact your life? Well, I mean, I think, one, just having to worry about these headaches, am I allowed to travel here, am I not allowed to travel there, I think makes us in a deep sense less free, the same way that a Black family traveling through the South was less free because they knew that there were lots of restaurants that that they couldn't eat at. Some they could, but lots they couldn't, because it was legal for restaurant owners to
Not just legally required, but go on.
legally required in some places, but there were
overwhelmingly legally required. Yeah.
Okay, let's.
Yeah. I think that's very important for that.
I think it's. I mean, there were restaurants. It's not that it wasn't, as a Black person in the South, there were no restaurants you weren't allowed to eat at. They have that. There were widespread laws. It was a patchwork of public and private. I do think that if the section of the Civil Rights Act that Rand Paul had a problem with, that outlawed voluntary segregation, I think if that wasn't there, I'm pretty sure that it would still be the case that a Black family traveling through the South, there would be lots of restaurants in certain regions that they couldn't eat at. That's an empirical claim, of course, but I mean it's one. So it's one that I feel very confident about. Mm-hmm. But going back to the roads, what would you wouldn't. If you weren't able to travel, stretch here or stretch there, then one, you'd have to spend a lot more time driving, and two, in some situations like the Bridgegate one, like, hey, you need to get to a hospital right now, that could impact your life quite severely. And it seems to me that it is a public good, and how much control do we have over it? Well, one sort of, very limited. It should be much more. But one sort of control that we have over it is that I think there are some pretty hard limits to tolls that can be set without constituents getting upset about it. Another limit that we have over it, another form of control that we have over it, is that you're never going to get a state that is going to just pass a law empowering the governor to whimsically, punish his political opponents by causing traffic jams, because the public wouldn't stand for it. And again, how much would it impact your life? Well, maybe on some days you couldn't get to the hospital when you needed to and people would die. On other days, you just had severe inconvenience. But I think the real question for me is it the case that you can go through life without having to worry about this, that you just know that you have a right, just by virtue of being a person, to drive on, to drive, I guess not literally on every road, because there are private roads, but damn near any road, anytime you want to go from point A to point B, you have a right to drive on those roads. And versus like how important a kind of freedom is that versus the freedom of the freedoms of property owners that would be enforced in this setup, or for that matter, our freedom not to finance things. And that's obviously just a very deep just a very deep gap, but I think it's one that's worth highlighting. But in any case, I'm gonna give you the last word here, because you have been a good sport and very thoughtful, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but please.
Yeah, so I would like to come on again, because the road stuff is very much outside of my normal area. So again, I'm not an economist. I know just a little bit about this. So for example, it might seem weird, the roads being commons, but historically, prior to the roads we know now, that is historically the predominant form of roads is as commons rather than private toll roads. But leaving that aside, I want to kind of reiterate, we shouldn't be comparing like an ideal state to a realistic stateless libertarian free society. Instead, we should be comparing a realistic version of either, right? And a realistic version of either, is it the case that certain stretches of road are going to be just flimsily declared, if that you're flimsily not able to travel certain stretches of road in the existing society, not always in so directly, although historically, of course, might be some issues there. But it is the case that when you're driving on a state road, you know that you might get pulled over for speed traps for all sorts of reasons, right? And the state police force, which has a unique special right over to enforce the law that is not questioned by anyone else, that gives them special abilities to decide that it's time for you to go to jail, um, to use force in ways that are not with very different levels uh, of standards between them and the average person on defense, things like that. That when you have if you want to have the state providing you with roads, you're going to have to come along with those things. So you mentioned earlier, libertarians who are minarchists, meaning that they believe in, they don't believe in a lot of state functions, but they do believe in courts, police, and military being state owned. For me, my libertarianism, this is something I would like to talk about more specifically if we do this again, is for me, the strongest case for libertarianism is a functional political economy in which we can live without the night watchman state, that that we can have a civilized society that does not include the police, the military, or government courts, right? Because for me, the monopoly power on those things, it's often going to involve a lot of, as you correctly put it, concessions, but those will be concessions meant to maintain their power, to use as they see fit. And so again, I will happily concede that I am not the most well-versed on all these roads questions specifically, but for me, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we what is the comparative benefit of getting rid of things like the police, prisons, so on and so forth, and what does the world that look like that, is it worth a lot of these concessions to keep putting up with the police, the military, so on and so
Well,
forth?
and also, is that the question? Like, are those the alternatives to
That's
have a state, a ruling class, and some good concessions, to have a free market libertarian utopia, or is there a third alternative, where we have a democratic socialist state and we don't have a ruling class? But I think, and I think that issue you identified, about the police pulling people over, I think is exactly the place to pick up when you come back,
okay, great.
because I think that's I think the public versus private versions of those functions. I think, like I wanted, I wanted to do the road thing, just because I hear this all
Yeah,
the
I
time,
understand, yeah.
as a meme, and I was so fascinated when I saw you'd read that article, and also it's just fun because, like, I want to title this episode "No, but seriously, what about the roads?" But I think that as far as advancing the conversation in interesting ways, public versus private versions of all of those functions that you just identified,
Right.
I think that's the place to go. So I hope you do come back, and I
Okay,
hope
great. Yeah.
when you do, that's the plan that we're going to pick up right there.
Excellent. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.